So yeah, the first painting is by Ian Grant, who's a Sydney-based painter, and it's called East, in brackets, yellow. So the title gives us a sort of a sense of which way we're facing, but also a sense of what the colour, the basic colour palette, or the tendency of the muted colours is. You might not think there's a lot of yellow in it to start with. There isn't. You know, it's not a yellow painting, and in fact it's next to a painting that probably has more of what we would call yellow. But the green up close kind of tends towards a yellow, and I suppose there's a general warmth to the painting. Now I can think of three traditions or sort of areas that this painting draws upon. First would be Romanticism, which is a Northern European tradition. Second would be tonalism, which is a way of painting with a very restricted palette, not so many bright colours, but fairly earthy colours. And thirdly, and less so, but I think that painting from photography has been an aspect of this artist's practice, although I don't think he works exclusively from photos, I don't think he relies on photos, but certainly there is almost a photographic sense to this image. The Romanticism I mentioned, German Romanticism, you're thinking of an artist like Caspar David Friedrich, who was the most famous of those painters, and a typical or famous work by him would have been, I think it's called The Monk and the Sea. A single figure, a very small figure against a vast seascape, and a sense of the sort of loss of self, or the individual in the face of this vast reality that almost swamps one. And yet within that there's a sense of awe and beauty verging upon, what would you say, an almost awesome sense of danger, or this bigger reality, which is referred to as the sublime, that double-edged sense of awe and yet terror, possibly. Now, looking at this painting, it's not quite as romantic as that, and it's a much more prosaic subject. It's just an ordinary tree in an unremarkable field. But there is still that sense of identifying with one central motif. It's not a human being, it's a tree, it's not a remarkable tree, but I suppose what is remarkable and what the artist is attuning himself to is that very subtle quality of backlighting. And this brings us to another tradition, which is tonalism. Now, I've already mentioned tonalism. It's basically a technical idea of restricted palette. You could probably, now hang on, I better not say this. I was going to say you could probably construct this painting out of 3 or 4 colours. I'm not sure exactly what is on his palette, but he's using what we call chromatic greys. And I had Ian as a lecturer, and he taught me about chromatic greys. A chromatic grey is when you mix a colour like burnt sienna with, say, Prussian blue and add white, and you get a grey that isn't the same as a grey that you'd get from black and white. It's a very subtle grey. You can push it towards warmth or coolness. And that's what he's playing with here, a subtle shift between warmth and coolness, but with a predominant warmth. You'll notice in the sky, which appears at first to be flat, there's an ever so slight shift from a cleaner white up to a kind of a more beige colour. And yeah, we're talking technique here, I suppose, but the ultimate point of this is that it's a very quiet painting. It has an atmosphere of introspection. So we're looking out at the world, and yet there's a sense of, I suppose you could say, looking into oneself or quietening oneself to appreciate this humble but beautiful view. Yeah, it's a painting I really like, and I think over time, little things that you may not notice at first, the positioning and scale, both of these little patches of grass, but also the space between them, and the way that the shape that they create is a sort of an echo or a mirror image of the shape that this creates. It's a very nicely crafted, satisfying picture. I want to look at a pair of paintings now that are more urban in their interpretation of what landscape could be. And this is John Bokor, a painter, again, born in Sydney but lives now, I think, down towards Wollongong. And he's been a painter of suburban subjects for quite a few years, but it's a very different style to Ian Grant that we've just seen. It's a more painterly style. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean, he's pushing the paint around, he's putting it on and taking it away. It's a more, in a sense, forgiving and yet high-risk process. Forgiving in that if it doesn't work, you just scrape it back and start again. But high risk because the big changes that you're making very quickly could cause the whole thing to kind of fall in and collapse as a composition. The colours could easily become very dirty. You'll notice that there's a much broader palette here, a full palette. And if you ask the question of yourself, what is the main colour in this composition? It's hard to say because this yellow is a kind of a large area, the green is equal, but I think that the blue of the sky and the grey of the ground kind of become one ground against which there's all this hustle and bustle of the local shops sort of dances. It's a very positive view. It's not a remarkable place. It's a very ordinary subject. And I'd say what John Bockhor shares with Ian Grant is the idea that you don't have to look at something special or remarkable to make a painting that holds your attention and satisfies your curiosity. It's in how you interpret, it's in what you bring to the subject. And as I said before, it's a very affirmative view. You could also say a nostalgic view of that daily routine of going to the shops. I should mention that in terms of tradition, urban painting and expressionism is the other tradition that John's working with. I mean, you could think of somebody like Oskar Kokoschka. I don't know if that's a name that rings a bell for any of you, but that very free handling of paint has a very rich history, especially in the 20th century. And I'd say that a painter like John is even interested in abstract expressionism and the way that those especially American painters had a very kind of mobile and almost aggressive approach to building a paint surface, even though the ultimate effect here is not aggressive, but there's a lot of vigour in the working of the painting.